Hi guys, it's Blackie for Shaman's Forge Bushcraft. Today I would like to talk about shotguns and do a little explanation about it, because shotguns are they're kind of a complicated subject. And for many people who are not brought up in a hunting family or things like that, it can be a little bit daunting at times. And in bushcraft, a lot of people have been talking about wanting to carry a single shot shotgun or a pump or etc. And I would like to try to bring some clarity to this. Now I'm going to be speaking in very general terms here. I understand, there's a lot of people out there with a lot of gun experience, a lot of history that's going to have but wait moments in what I'm about to say, but that's okay because I'm speaking in general guidelines. And there's very few things in life, especially with firearms, that you can say this is absolute, because there will probably be an exception to that rule somewhere. Okay, so let's get started. All guns were originally shotguns. That was the first gun invented. It was simply a tube plugged up at one end with which gunpowder was put in, some sort of wadding, and then a projectile of some kind, either a round ball, a cylinder, shot, which is small round balls, a rock, whatever. Even an arrow has been used. It was then ignited through a hole in the side of the barrel where a fuse or gunpowder was set afire with a torch, and it went foosh, bang. Okay? Now, rifles came about later, but we're going to stick with shotguns. Shotguns are the most versatile firearm we have. And I know that sounds like a bold statement, but it is. Virtually every species of game animal can be taken with some form of shotgun. It has limited range, but it has very good effect and power at close range, and that's what it's designed for. Now, there's a lot of different gauges. There's a lot of different chokes. There's a lot of different shot sizes, and I'm going to address each one of them in turn. But for right now, let's look at gauges. Okay? So to begin with, we're going to look at some shotgun shells. Now, the original shotgun shells were these. This is an all-metal shotgun shell. Okay? Originally they were paper wrapped or something like that, or a tube of paper with a metal end cap, but all metal shotgun shells, which you can still purchase from certain places. And you would put a primer in the base, in would go powder, wad, cup, shot, and a wad on top, and that would be your shot cartridge. Modern shot cartridges come in a plastic tube with a metal base, and still the same principle as this, and they come in various gauges. Now we have a 410, we have a 20 gauge, and we have a 12 gauge. Now, in the gun era, when shotguns and all were evolving, why we ended up with so many different ones was because of what the guns came from. Now you're going to hear of other gauges. For example, the total list that I'm aware of that you might be able to find are 410, 28 gauge, 20 gauge, 16 gauge, 12 gauge, 10 gauge, 8 gauge. Now, the 410 is a caliber, it's not a gauge, and it evolved from a shot cartridge from either the 4440 rifle shot cartridge or the 410 shot cartridge that became very popular in Europe for sword cane guns and small vest pocket things to take care of snakes and things. The two of them around early 1900 kind of blurred together and became what we call today the 410. It's just a rifle caliber shot cartridge. Very good for use for small game like small birds, rabbits, things in the garden, snakes, things like that. It also, you can get slugs and buckshot for hunting bigger game with it at extremely close range. The 20 gauge. This gauge was created because of the trade guns of the 17 and 1800s. They were commonly 62 caliber. 62 caliber today we call 20 gauge. 12 gauge. 12 gauge comes from the old British musket 75 caliber Brown Bess, which was 75 caliber, we call it a 12 gauge. The 16 gauge came from the French 69 caliber gun. And as these guns through history kind of merged, blended, disappeared, and became the common gauge, because everybody was used to that gauge, and each one had its following in strength. Now, let me explain a basic principle here. The pellets in this 410 and the pellets in this 12 gauge can be the same size pellet, let's say number 6. The speed at which that pellet is traveling at, let's say, 30 yards can be the same speed from both of these. So a 410's pellet, single pellet, hitting has the same power as a 12 or a 10 gauge single pellet. The thing is how many pellets are going. And that's one of the reasons we have so many different gauges. When you increase the shot size, the payload, you went to a bigger diameter tube to get a bigger payload. So for something up close, a 410. For something with distance and range, a 12 or a 20. Now today, with modern shells, my recommendation is look at either a 12 or a 20 gauge. If you're in the northern parts of the country and you deal a lot with bears and big animals, I recommend a 12 gauge. Although we're getting a lot of bears here in lower Alabama now too. But I prefer a 20 gauge. And I'm a little bit nostalgic, and I've had a trade gun from the old days. It's a 62 caliber flintlock, and I grew up shooting 20 gauges. And out to say 30 yards, there's not a lot of difference between a 12 and a 20 in comparable loads. Remember, the pellets are moving the same speed. It's how big is the payload that we're delivering. Because a 20 gauge is a 7/8 ounce a shot, can be a 1, and a 12 gauge is a 1 ounce to 1 1/4 ounce a shot. So the difference in number of shot is not very much. The speed's the same. I like toting 20s because I can physically carry more 20s for the same weight than I can 12s. And for shooting up close at a small game like rabbits and squirrel, which is 90% of my woods foraging with such a weapon, there ain't enough difference to really matter. So I prefer to tote a 20. Now, you'll also hear about slight differences in these shells, like a 2 3/4 inch length. They're talking about this length right here. Now, if you have a shotgun and it says it has a 2 3/4 inch chamber, it means that the shell it takes is a standard 2 3/4. A 3-inch will physically fit, but you should not fire it. The reason it fits is directly in front of that shell, there's like a little funnel opening, and that's because this plastic in the front of the shell has to open up. That's the room for it to open. Well, if you slide a 3-inch shell in there, it will physically fit in, but what it's done is now it's up against, and there's not room for it to open up, and the pressures go way on up. It is not safe to do that. Okay, look on the barrel and it will say 2 3/4, and then beside it, it should say 2 3/4 inch chamber, 3-inch or 3.5 inch chamber for 12 gauges. Now you can get 20 gauges in 2 3/4 and 3, and you can get 12 gauges in 2 3/4, 3, and 3.5. Now let me show you that. This is a 2 3/4. This is a 3.5. Notice that big size difference? That's because of, like we just said, payload. A 12 gauge 3.5 is duplicating 10 gauge power in a 12 gauge. The payload up here is a 10 gauge payload. And where you see these is to be used for waterfowl like geese, big ducks, range heavy power. And also some turkey hunters use this. It's also in heavy country where you're looking for big powerful loads to take on moose, bear, stuff like that. It don't mean you can't shoot the short ones. You can always shoot the shorter shell in the longer chamber, but you cannot shoot the longer shell in the short chamber. Capiche? Okay. Again, I'm speaking in generalities. So, let me recap right quick. I'm going to touch on many of these other things in follow-up videos, so let's just stay in this line. The two shells that I recommend you look at if you're looking at buying a gun are 12 gauge or 20 gauge. Ask yourself, what am I going to be using this for? If it's going to be hunting, I recommend a 12 gauge. Go ahead and get the 12 gauge. If it's going to be rabbits, squirrels, few birds, I'm not really interested in big game. I'm not in an area that has big old huge hogs or big bears or anything that I might have to defend myself with. 20 gauge. You know. When we talk about shot sizes, I'll talk about what shots for. When we talk about choke, I'll talk about range. This was to give you a very brief idea of the various gauges and how they interrelate to one another. 410s are extremely popular. That Judge pistol is a very popular gun, and it's a great woods companion. A 410 is a very good woods companion for shooting up close at predominantly snakes as a snake charmer, also for shooting squirrels, rabbits, small game, bird. My uncle had quite a few very large whitetail hanging on the wall of his study. I think it was 11 or 12 of them that he had taken with a double barrel 410, because the hunting club he was part of only allowed shotguns, and he had a double barrel 410 that he had hand loaded and practiced with that he could shoot out to 75 yards very, very effectively. So he used it as a slug gun, basically a musket. With practice, any of the gauges will serve your job that you need. It's just how much power do you need and how much weight do you want to tote. Hope this helps, guys. Please leave any questions or comments down below, and I'll be glad to answer them one-on-one as best I can. I'm Blackie for Shaman's Forge Bushcraft, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.